Ruth chapter 1. So we'll start the book of Ruth and we'll follow this all the way through. And we'll probably jump back into Psalms maybe after that, do a few Psalms. We'll just see how it goes. And I think we're going to step into maybe some minor prophets after that. Kind of got a group of books that we want to cover, but I haven't really decided exactly what direction we'll go. But we'll be in Ruth here for a few weeks. So the book of Ruth, if you just look to the left of Ruth, you'll see the book of Judges. And so the book of Ruth actually takes place during the time of the Judges. And so the book sort of acts as a transition from Judges to Samuel, which is Samuel was a prophetic judge that brought about the kingship of Saul, but ultimately King David. And so this is a transition from this time when everyone did what was right in their own eyes for 400 years, roughly this time of Judges, when the nation had come in and taken the promised land, but then they pulled away from holding Yahweh as their Lord and King. And they became disjointed and weren't unified. The tribes weren't unified together as one nation. And so the nations were characterized, the tribes were characterized as everyone was doing what was right in their own eyes. So the book of Ruth takes place in the time of Judges. We don't know exactly where, and we'll kind of explore some of that as we go. We don't know who the author of Ruth is, though there's many speculations, and they're just speculations. Nobody really knows, and really doesn't change the way we read the book or understand the story. The story is one of God's providence, although God does not appear as the main character. That we see Ruth and Naomi come to the front and center as being sort of the main characters. But as we step back and look at it, we see that God is the main character through the whole thing, and his providence and his work that he is doing behind the scenes, whether anybody at that time ever recognized it or not. And so his providence will work through primarily Naomi and Ruth, and it is the story of the lineage of David. And so Ruth will come to meet Boaz and has Obed, who has Jesse and who begat David. And so as we begin to see Ruth in the story, we can know that is David's grandmother, or great-grandmother. And so providence is a word you're going to hear a lot of as we go on. And so I want to just, by way of defining it so everybody understands what we're saying when we talk about providence. Providence is God's ongoing care, preservation, governance of all creation, including the natural world and human history. This concept encompasses God's sustaining power that maintains the universe and his direction of events towards the fulfillment of his purposes. Providence is not limited to specific interventions, but is understood as God's constant and absolute rule over all creation. It includes both his foreknowledge and his active involvement in guiding circumstances. And so we think about that providence of God and that definition, and we think about maybe when the idea of seeing a flood go through and wipe out so many people's lives in North Carolina, infect so many in Florida in a storm, and honestly could go around the world and see these things. And we'll see the providence of God as just as it affects the family and bad things happen in this family, and how maybe they looked at it, and maybe that is a clue of maybe how we should be a little bit more attentive to those things and those ideas in our days when we see these things. While the Bible speaks as Satan as the ruler of this world, he answers to God. And while our enemy steals and kills and destroys, we can know that God is at work in the midst of all of that. His light shines brightest in the dark. He does, or at least his greatest accomplishments are more visible to us from the dark. And maybe that's a better way to put it. The dark clouds of life don't block the providence of God. They have no effect on the providence of God. More often, they just affect our ability to see God's providence. So let's jump into Ruth chapter 1. We'll read a short section here. Really, we're just going to read verse 1 at first to get started. Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. And so it sets the stage as these days when the judges ruled. And again, we could sort of, just to have that context to understand what's going on in the land, it was everyone doing what was right in their own lives because there was no one holding a standard of righteousness and justice and sort of all of those things. And so the nation was not unified under the Lord. And you can imagine that that affected worship. We get examples of that in Judges of just the Levites and some of the ways they were worshiping incorrectly and even worshiping other gods. We can see then judgment in the land because this is fresh from understanding when they went into the promised land that if they followed the Lord and were followed his commandments and his statutes and walked in his ways and worshiped only him, he would bless their socks off, so to speak. If they didn't, or he didn't really say if they didn't, he said when you don't follow me, when you stray away and begin to follow the gods, then the skies are going to close up. You're not going to get rain. You're not going to have crops. What crops you have, the enemy is going to come in and eat your crops. They're going to live in your houses. They're going to, and it's just one thing after another. You get this nice group of blessings if you follow God, and you get about 10 times as many curses if you don't. And so in this time of Judges, you begin to see what was going on, and they were oppressed, overrun by the Ammonites, the Midianites, the Philistines, the Canaanites, and others. And among those were the Moabites, which is kind of interesting that early in the book of Judges, we see this king. He had a weight problem, it says. If you remember King Eglon, and he was the Moabite king, and they oppressed Israel, and at least a section of Israel, and then Ehud come along as a judge, and he did bad things and killed Eglon and left him where his, if you remember, his court didn't want to go in the room because they thought he was in the bathroom. And so anyway, he was dealt with by the judges. And so you see that Moab, there was a time, and you can see that they were an enemy of Israel. So it's the time of the judges. This kind of sets the stage, the context of it. There was a famine in the land, which wouldn't surprise you because that's consistent with what God said would happen if they turned away from him. And so this certain man of Bethlehem, which you will find out is Elimelech, of Judah, he went to the country of Moab with his wife and his 2 sons. So this was of all the places you could go, this, for whatever reason, made sense to him. But he's leaving Bethlehem. Bethlehem means house of bread. And there is no bread in the house of bread. And the way he's going is like reversing, coming into the promised land. He's going to travel almost the same, reversing his route, going back towards the wilderness to a people that had done them wrong on the way to the promised land. And a people that had led, the Moabites had led the Israelites into false worship and worshiping Baal of Peor, and it caused a lot of problem for them. Moab is the descendants of an incestuous relationship of Lot. They were idolaters. worshiping Chemosh, worshipped Chemosh with a child sacrifice. And so this is just a little glimpse of the land that they ran to for relief from the famine. It leaves you wondering, why in the world would a good Israelite run to that land? And maybe the answer is, it doesn't really say he was a good Israelite. Elimelech's sojourn looks a little bit like Abraham's. Abraham, he ran down to Egypt because of a famine, and that's when Abraham brought back his handmaid, who would bring an offspring that would taunt and be an enemy of Israel forever. And of course, we'll see Naomi bring something a little bit more special back with her. She does a little bit better than Abraham did. And so we see Elimelech, he is running from starvation, but he's running to death. He's leaving this house of bread where there is no bread, probably because of judgment. And he's running to a land characterized by death, and he's running into the arms of death. Verse 2, the name of the man was Elimelech, the name of his wife Naomi. The names of the two sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to the country of Moab and remained there. There Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left and her two sons. Now they took wives of the women of Moab. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth, and they dwelt there about 10 years. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and so the women survived her two sons. The woman survived and her two sons and her husband. Pardon me. So Elimelech, his name means God is king. And which is kind of interesting because there's really not a lot of indication that he lived as if God was king, which was, again, the story of the time of Judges. Naomi means beautiful, full of grace, along those lines, sort of that idea of being graceful and beautiful. And the names of the two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, mean sickly and wasting away. Would you like to have your kids just like, I can't wait to have kids, I want to name him Wasting Away? It's kind of weird, isn't it? But names had meaning. Names were often given because of the situation or whatever was around. And this may be an indication of what was going on in the land and the famine and what was happening in Bethlehem at the time. And maybe that there were many and have children there, to name them sickly and wasting away may be an indication of that. Said they were Ephrathites, which is a word, it could be a geographical designation or a tribe or a clan sort of designation, but it's used between different tribes, so I think it's more of a geographical thing, but there's some question about what that might mean. But these men were labeled as Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to the country of Moab and remained there, which appears to be running from God. If this is God's judgment on the land, then rather than being part of the solution, they have turned away, run away, and run back to a land of other gods and other people. And so we see a problem with faithfulness, a problem with commitment, and maybe running into the arms of the enemy, so to speak. In that culture, you would tend to think that this was Elimelech that made the decision, but I think we can question that, whether this wasn't more of a family decision or could have even been a decision of Naomi to do such a thing. Elimelech gets into the land and he dies what appears to be almost immediately, and she is left with her two sons. So as bad as things would be for a widow in that day that had no way to provide for herself, she had two sons that would take care of her, and provide for her. And so that was good. And now they took wives, and Orpah means a double-minded. Ruth means beautiful friendship. And so they take these wives, and they are married and dwelt in Moab about 10 years. So if a famine was going in the land, this is characterized as a sojourn. We're not going to Moab to stay. We're just sojourning there to have food to survive, and then we're going to come back to our land is sort of the picture that is presented. But now 10 years later, he has died. Both of the males died, and the fact that there are these deaths in the family, now there's these 3 women that have no way to take care of themselves. They have no children, which is kind of also maybe points back towards the curses on the family, that these men, that both of them would marry women, be married 10 years and not have children. Sort of would have been seen as their wombs were closed up for this, and that and it's kind of an indication again of maybe God's judgment, or we should at least consider that. And we look at this and go, culturally and personally in their lives, they would have never thought that this is God's providence, this is God at work in our lives. In any way, shape, or form, they would have just saw tragedy. It would have just, as we would experience this as absolute tragedy, and to see the death of these men and that these women be stuck in that culture without any hope of relief and really even to take care of themselves. And what a difficult thing. And they would not ever look at that and say, well, we believe God's providence is at work. Verse 6. Then she arose, talk about Naomi, she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the country of Moab. For she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had visited his people by giving them bread. Therefore she went out from the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. And Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, go, return each to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant you that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband. And we'll stop there for just a moment. Naomi, it says she arose. She is at that place, and after the death of their sons, that it is very clear that there's no provision for her, no real hope, and her best hope is to return to her land. And she arose that because she heard that there was food in the land, and that the Lord was bringing bread upon them. And so she sees that as a blessing and a hope, and maybe a way for survival. She goes to her daughter-in-laws and she says, it's been nice. You need to stay here. You need to return to your house of your mother. She doesn't say return to the house of your father, which would be more of the idea that you would think. But it's a mother who would help a young daughter find a husband. It's a mother that would coach and counsel a daughter into finding a husband. So the idea of returning to your mother's house is the idea of Naomi saying, you need to find husbands in your land. Go to your mother. She'll help you get married. Because in the end, she says, the Lord grants that you find rest, each in the household of your husband. She is wanting them to have that opportunity to get married, go on, have a family, and move on with your lives. And she's saying, go return to your mother, because there was no hope to be found with her and staying with her. In saying that the Lord deal kindly with you is is like her giving this blessing over them. And so she's saying that this blessing is, the word chesed, it's like an Old Testament idea of grace, that we understand grace. It's covenant, love, faithfulness, mercy, favor, kindness. It's honestly, it's a great contrast to everything they'd experienced. And so she's going to go back home just trying to hope survive, to find food. She's saying, daughters, go on with your life, get married, have kids, settle in with a new husband. May the Lord bless you and be kind to you and just be gracious to you. And she just wants to see them have a good life. And again, such a contrast to all that they had been through up to that point. So she kissed, second half, verse 9, so she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and they wept. And they said to her, surely we will return with you into your people. But Naomi said, turn back, my daughter. Why will you go with me? Are there still sons in my womb that may be your husbands? And so the idea, again, we see this. She started with go, return to your mother's house. Now she says, turn back, my daughters. And it's a rhetorical question. Why will you go with me? She's not asking for an answer. The question is, there's no reason to go with me. There's no hope to be found in going with me. There's still sons in my womb is sort of a reference to the Levirate marriage of the law. There was a provision made in the law that if a man died and without an heir, that a brother would step into his place and take that woman as wife and father a child for his brother, that lineage would go on, and that dead brother would have an heir. And she's saying, I don't have any more sons. My sons died. There are no more sons, and there's no hope for any sons. So there would be no hope by going with me. I can't provide husbands for you, which was the argument for them to return to their mom. Verse 12. Again, she says, turn back, my daughters, go, for I am too old to have a husband. And if I should say I have hope, if I should have a husband tonight and should bear the sons, would you wait for them until they were grown? Would you restrain yourselves from having husbands? No, my daughters, for it grieves me very much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Then they lifted up their voices and they wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And so again she says, turn back. I'm too old to have a husband. And even if I had a husband now, and I had a husband and I got pregnant and I had children, which all indications that's not going to happen. But even if it did, would you wait for them to grow up in order for them to then father a child? And this is still not typical because it would be from another man, but even if that fit the Levirate marriage that could step in and provide, you would have such a strange situation because you'd have a young man that would end up being 16, 17 years old and trying to act as a father for a 40-something-year-old woman if she was able to still have children. And she's saying to the daughters, would you even wait for them? Which makes no sense. And if you waited, would they even be willing to step into that role? And so as she stacks up this, I don't have a husband. If I did have a husband, this is crazy. You need to turn back, go to your mother's house. It's the only way it will go. And so she makes the point, says, it grieves me very much for your sakes. I hate that it's like this, that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. It's interesting because the hand of the Lord so many times is characterized, phrases talk about the hand of the Lord is not too short to reach in any direction, that the hand of the Lord is at work behind the scenes, that the hand of the Lord brought the children of Israel out of bondage. The hand of the Lord does these things. But in this case, the hand of the Lord is characterized as having done something negative. That the hand of the Lord has gone out against her. And she's like, I feel bad that I couldn't have provided something better and a better life and, with her sons, and that she couldn't provide husbands for these daughter-in-laws. And so they lift up their voices, and it seems like Orpah kisses her mother, and she's going to go on her way. But Ruth clings to her, it says. And so we see one left and one stayed. Before we move on, we look at Orpah and we go, well, I wonder what happened to Orpah. And as is so often the case where the scriptures don't tell us, that the rabbis tend to fill in blanks on their own, which is not scripture and it doesn't mean anything to us, but they formed a tradition that Orpah went 4 miles with Naomi, and she cried 4 tears. And there was this sort of sequence of events that she did, and then she went on to get married, and she had children, and she fathered these children, and the oldest one was named Goliath, and Goliath's brother. So, and it's kind of interesting that's the way one of the rabbis explained what happened to Orpah. So verse 15, and she said, look, your sister-in-law has gone back to the people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. So again, we see this for the 4th time now. She's saying, go back, go back. You need to go back now like your sister has gone back, Ruth. You need to follow her and go find a husband. And this is when that famous passage is stuck in our brain because of reading it. It's so memorable. It's touching. We sing it in songs. Ruth said, entreat me not to leave you or to turn back from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me. And so we see Ruth's just incredible commitment of her life, and we see her, she is determined to go with Naomi. And the walk back home is uphill. Physically, it's all uphill. And spiritually, it's all uphill. And emotionally, it would be all uphill. And this walk back home would be a walk of faith because there was no real true hope awaiting them other than this idea that there was bread there. What an incredible thing. God gave her this little picture that there was bread there was food, there was provision there. And it was just the providence of God again at work in her life. And this commitment of Ruth to go, how do you explain that? Wherever Naomi went, Ruth said she would follow her. Ruth was committed without boundaries. He said, I'll follow you unless, of course, I get tired or I don't like the direction you're going or my feet begin to hurt or whatever it is. She was committed to following her without boundaries. And she says, where you stay, I will stay, which is whether we go to Bethlehem or we go wherever, I'm going to follow you and I'm going to stay with you. And wherever you lodge, I'm going to lodge with you. Whatever is good enough for you is good enough for me. And the idea is that I'm going to go and be with you. And if I never have a husband, I could have went back and lodged with my mother, and maybe she would have got me married off and had a family and had a home, and I could have lodged there and had kids and a family and everything. But I am committed to going with Naomi, and wherever you live, wherever you lodge, that's where I'm going to go. And so the idea is that even if I don't ever find that husband and have a home of my own, she says, your people will be my people. And in saying that, Ruth is forsaking Moab, her home, her gods, the culture, the heritage, all that she grew up, she's turning away from it. She's walking away from all that. This is quite a picture begin to form up now, because you have this Gentile following this Jewish woman back to Israel. And we know that she's going to become a Gentile bride. And she is turning towards Naomi, towards God, to take her God, and turning away from her gods and turning away from all of her old life. Some of that maybe sounds familiar. She's committed to living as a Jew. She says, your God is my God. Ruth rejected the Baals. She rejected Chemosh and child sacrifice and the Baals and all their sacrifice and worship. She was embracing Yahweh as her God. And so when we look at that and you go, how does that happen in Ruth? Where does this commitment come from? And it came from being, for 10 years, being within this family with Naomi. And so Naomi has this sort of, I don't know, it comes across as negativity. She says, for your sakes, I'm very sorry that the hand of God has gone out against me. But she's just kind of stating the fact that God's hand has gone out against her, but she's not complaining. And it sort of gives you the sense that, yes, God's hand's gone out against me, but I deserved it. Or maybe that's exactly what God is being faithful to what he said would happen if we acted in a certain way. You don't hear her really complaining, just appears to be stating facts. And so Naomi has an understanding of God, of who Yahweh is and the way he acts. And you got to think that regardless of, she's trying to send Ruth home, Ruth is saying, no, your God is my God. And so it's something we need to remember, that we don't underestimate the spiritual influence that you have on another person. Even when you think they're not paying attention, even when you think they have no understanding of your faith or what's really going on, they are watching you. Don't underestimate the influence that you have on other people, whether it's in your home, at your workplace, light to night, whatever it may be. Though Naomi spoke of the circumstances of her life, and they seemed to be very negative, her call home displayed her commitment to Yahweh and to her people and to her life. And Ruth is saying, your life is my life. And where you die, I will die. And which is a commitment that says only death will separate us. And this commitment to say only death will separate us is Ruth's commitment to say, is a promise to Naomi to say, I will bury you when you die, and I will give you a proper burial in a proper place with your family. And then Ruth wanted to be, when she died, buried right next to her, or buried right with her. And she ends this commitment that she gives with this oath. And she says, the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me. And so she's presenting this as an oath. An oath was normally sealed with a sacrifice, and the idea of saying, to do so to me and more also is say, if I break this oath, if I don't do the things I just detailed, then I should end up like that sacrifice that was used to seal this. If the sacrifice, the cutting of the covenant, so to speak, of that animal was sacrificed to show the promise and the oath that was made, and if I don't fulfill my oath, then I should die just like that animal, that sacrifice was offered. Verse 18 then, you see Naomi gets it, right? She just heard this, and she's like, there's no reason to keep pushing this. After 4 times telling them to turn around, turn around, turn around. Verse 18, when she saw that she was determined to go with her, she stopped speaking to her. That didn't mean she gave her the cold shoulder. Fine. No, she stopped speaking of turning back, but that she received that commitment, and she received family, and she received Ruth as a loving daughter, and one that was going to persevere with her. Verse 19, now the 2 of them went until they came to Bethlehem. And it happened, well, when they had come to Bethlehem, that all the city was excited because of them. And the woman said, is this Naomi? But she said to them, do not call me Naomi, call me Mara. For the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. I went out full, and the Lord has brought me home again empty. And why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me? So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, as she returned from the country of Moab. And now they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. And you go, hey, what a coincidence that they arrived during the harvest. What an amazing thing. And of course, it is no coincidence. It's the providence of God to deliver them at exactly the right time, because God had something in mind. So Naomi sees the commitment of Ruth to follow her, and the 2 go back to Bethlehem. All of the city of Bethlehem was probably no more than a couple hundred people at that time. And it could have been considerably less because of the previous famine. A couple hundred people are in a small community like that, know about everyone. And of course, even after 10 years or more, Naomi comes back, and all of the city was excited because of seeing Naomi come. Is this Naomi? Is this that woman? And of course, it might have been an honest question that this woman is now older. She's a little bit beat up from the world. She's a little beat up from her circumstances. And Naomi answers and says, don't call me Naomi. Instead, call me Mara. Instead of graceful and beautiful, just call me bitter. See, it's not appropriate to call me graceful and beautiful. It's only appropriate to call me bitter. But maybe also the idea is that she was coming in humility and brokenness with a contrite heart. Maybe it was, in fact, Naomi's idea to leave Bethlehem. And maybe that running away from Bethlehem was a running from her God and from the judgment and from the things that they had not done well in their relationship with the Lord. And in returning, she felt the conviction, and then of course she's bringing home a Moabite woman into their community. And there's always the risk that she would not be accepted. You can imagine that moment as she come into town and probably feeling very bitter and remembering the famine and remembering leaving with her husband and her children. And she says, I went out full and I came back empty, but she didn't. And it probably seemed that way to her as she came back and all the memories of her town and where she grew up, where she got married and had kids. As she came back without them, but she came back with Ruth. When she said, I came back empty-handed, I kind of imagine Ruth goes, what about me? She said, the Lord has testified against me. She's not complaining. She's not saying it's unjust, that the Lord was unjust in anything that he did. The Almighty is the word El Shaddai. El Shaddai has afflicted me. And that affliction may well be exactly what the Lord said would happen if they acted unfaithfully as a nation. And so Naomi returned with Ruth. And they came to the house of bread, where there was bread and where there was a harvest. And you see the providence of God. So the dark clouds of life don't block out the providence of God. They just keep us from seeing clearly sometimes. And so Ruth seems to have ability to see some future, some hope, and something in Naomi that Naomi doesn't even see herself. Other than she knows, has this sense that she needs to return home. She is being drawn back home. And of course, as we look at it, we would say she is being drawn by the providence of God to take Ruth there. God is setting the stage for this providential work. And who could see it? Well, probably no one could really see the true and complete work he was doing. But who could know that God was at work? Well, everyone can, and we can too. We can know God's working in the darkest seasons of our lives. We often fail to see that. We fail to acknowledge that God might be working in these difficult and terrible circumstances because we don't like or agree with God's plans and his ways sometimes. I've had several conversations with people that, were praying for family, praying for friends, praying for people to come to salvation, and they feel that time is so short. And so those prayers turn to, God, do whatever you have to do. But sometimes when we see whatever God has to do, we don't like the looks of that. I've had several conversations with different folks about these storms. How do we, as Christians, look at these storms come through that just decimate so much a large area and just obliterate homes and lives, and many people died. And we can't rule out and say, well, God's providence didn't rule in the storms, as if only certain weather patterns or certain geographies we can't rule out. We have to say God's providence is right there in the midst of that, and that God was working something. And while the devil would maybe bring that in and use that for stealing and killing and destroying and destruction, God may have been allowing that in his providence to save the souls of many people. So the dark clouds of life do not harm the providence of God. If the election goes a different way than we understand it might, that we would like it to go, we don't. All is lost. I probably feel like that for a bit, but God remains on the throne, and if He allows that to happen, it'd be by His providence and a whole bunch of cheating by the enemy. But hey, the dark clouds of life don't harm the providence of God. They don't move the sovereignty of God or change it in any way. And so El Shaddai is at work. And we don't always like the way that work looks. Psalm 9 says, and those who know your name will put their trust in you. For you, Lord, have not forsaken those who seek you. Romans 8:31, and those who know your name will put their trust in you. For you, Lord, have not forsaken those who seek you. Many value and affectionately love the Lord Jesus. Yet they fall short of salvation by Him because they cannot find it in their hearts to completely and utterly forsake all of those other things of self-rule, the comfortable self-rule, the old life, the old man and the old ways. And even though in many cases that might mean darkness and suffering, but the people become even comfortable in those settings and struggle to turn away from that. We say, yes, I believe in Jesus, but I don't want to let go of that old life. And that is a common problem that we face. And it might be a problem that exists in this room. Yes, I love Christ, I acknowledge Christ, but you've come short of the salvation when you cannot completely turn away from the old life and turn to the Lord and trust wholly and completely in Him. If we resolve that nothing shall separate us from the Lord, which is a commitment, sounds very much like what Ruth said. Lord, well, I'll go wherever you call me to go. I'll do whatever you ask me to do. And often our commitment sounds like, Lord, I'm coming to you, and it better go okay, because you're on the clock. And if things don't look good, I'm going back home. And you hear it played out that many ways, but our commitment should sound like, Lord, I'm going to follow you, and I'll go wherever you tell me to go. I'll do whatever you tell me to do. I might complain, God, and it might be uncomfortable, but I know that if you called me to go in these difficult seasons or places, that you're going to work in my life and empower me and walk with me. And that's what the trust has to look like. Because if you resolve that nothing would separate you from the love of Christ or your duty to Christ, then nothing will separate you from the love of Christ. Period. Nothing. And so we see in just the first part of this story that providence begins to play out in the heart that's yielded to Him. It's just getting a glimpse of it. Even in the deepest, darkest struggles, we can see that God is working in people's lives and the circumstances and bringing about, setting the stage for this story where this mother will bring forth this one that will truly deliver the nation, unite them again under God, and establish a throne that will go on forever, a throne that the Messiah will sit on. This chapter began with starving and suffering and running away, maybe from judgment, but it delivers us right back to that same place in the house of bread with which acceptance and provision and a harvest and a family that has now suffered tragedy, and a widow and a Gentile return to this house. Again, that idea of setting the stage. And so many times we might run away from what God is trying to do in our life. And we take this big old long route, and we come right back to the same place. And realize my way didn't work out too good. God, I'm back. God says, I took you long enough. And He corrects you, and He loves you, and He spanks you and cleans you up and puts you back to work. Naomi dwelled on the circumstances in her past affliction, which is kind of interesting. So over and over, God's hand was against me, He testified against me, He afflicted me. She wasn't complaining, stating facts, almost with an understanding that she deserved it. But you get the sense that she says that she allowed her past and her circumstances to define who she was, that she should be called Mara. And she thinks that this past determines her future, that her past was bitter and she suffered, and that her life is now characterized by that suffering and that bitterness, and that was going to determine her future. Ruth followed Naomi with eyes on a great adventure, on a new God, a new life, a new family, a new home, and a devotion. What an incredible contrast, because you see this freshness of new life and new hope in Ruth. And she has something to And she gets this from Naomi, and she's going to give this back to her mother-in-law. This idea of a new life, of freshness, of forgiveness. And so we see that she would no longer be characterized by this bitterness, but by the love of family, of her daughter, and the providence of God and what he's doing. Once again, and just to end with this idea, if we turn to Jesus and resolve that nothing shall separate us from Christ Jesus our Lord, we may be sure that nothing ever could separate us. Let's bow our heads.